In the age of legends, when gods walked among mortals and the seas themselves held ancient power, there lived a Viking warrior whose name echoed through the halls of Valhalla. Standing upon the precipice of fate, he sensed something stirring beyond the horizon, a darkness that even the bravest berserker would fear to face. Long before our warrior's birth, an army had marched across these lands that no living soul dared speak of. Their bones now lay scattered like fallen leaves, yet something lingered in the mist that surrounded their eternal resting place. The very air seemed to whisper warnings to those brave enough to venture near these cursed grounds. Within the halls of ancient wisdom, a scholar had uncovered fragments of truth that had been buried for centuries. The parchment spoke of warriors who returned from death itself, bound by dark magic to serve an eternal master. Each symbol told a tale more terrifying than the last, warning of an army that knew no fear because they had already died once. Deep beneath the earth, where sunlight had never penetrated, an ancient evil stirred from its slumber. The figure that emerged from the darkness was no mere mortal, but something far more sinister. Its very presence corrupted the air around it, and the symbols carved into the walls began to glow with an unholy light that spoke of bargains made with death itself. In villages across the realm, blacksmiths worked tirelessly to forge weapons for those who would face the coming darkness. Steel rang against steel as blades were shaped and tempered, each one crafted with the hope that it might prove strong enough to turn back the tide of evil. Yet even the finest weapons would prove insufficient against enemies who could not truly die. Our Viking warrior gathered his most trusted companions, those who had faced death countless times and emerged victorious. Together they would sail toward the heart of darkness, armed with the knowledge they had gathered and the weapons forged in fire. Little did they know that their greatest battle would test not just their strength, but their very souls. As night fell upon the land, the boundary between the living and the dead grew thin. In cemeteries across the realm, the earth began to stir with unnatural movement. Those who had passed generations ago were no longer content to rest in peace, for they had been summoned by a power that would not be denied. The dead walked once more, but this time they served a master of darkness. At the heart of the storm-lashed mountain stood a fortress that had never been built by human hands. Its walls seemed to grow from the very rock itself, twisted and malformed by the dark magic that permeated every stone. From its highest tower, an army was being assembled, one that would march across the world and bring eternal night to all who opposed it. In the quiet moments before dawn, those chosen by fate began to see visions of what was coming. The eye became a window to other realms, showing glimpses of the army that approached. Warriors who had died in countless battles now marched as one, their spirits bound to weapons that could never truly be broken. Even the bravest hearts would falter when facing such an enemy. The Viking knew that time was running short. From his vantage point, he could see the enemy's camp stretching across the valley like a plague of locusts. Fires burned where no wood existed, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with unnatural heat. Yet he would not retreat, for some battles must be fought even when victory seems impossible. In hidden sanctuaries across the land, those who still remembered the old ways began their desperate rituals. The circle would need to be completed before the enemy's army reached the final stronghold. Ancient words of power were spoken, and the very fabric of reality began to bend. But such magic came with a price that few were willing to pay. As the first light of dawn touched the earth, villages across the realm told the same story. Families had fled in the night, leaving behind everything they held dear. Some said they had been warned by dreams, others claimed to have seen their own reflections walking away from their homes. Whatever the cause, the people knew that something was coming that no mortal army could stop. The warriors prepared themselves for battle in the only way they knew how. They called upon the rage of their ancestors, letting it fill their hearts and strengthen their arms. The berserker's roar echoed across the landscape like thunder itself, challenging the darkness to show itself. But even their legendary fury would prove insufficient against enemies who felt no pain. In the halls of learning, the wisest minds gathered to decipher the prophecies that spoke of this day. The ancient texts told of an army forged in the depths of despair, warriors who had traded their souls for eternal service. Each page revealed another horror, another warning that those who faced this enemy would never truly rest again. Even the mightiest ships could not weather every storm. As the longship battled the raging seas, something far more dangerous than mere weather emerged from the depths. The waves themselves seemed alive, reaching out with spectral hands to drag the warriors into the crushing darkness below. This was no ordinary battle against the elements. Men of faith turned to their gods for protection, knowing that mortal weapons would prove inadequate. The knight knelt before sacred altars, his armor polished to mirror brightness as he sought divine intervention. But the heavens remained silent, and even the most devout began to wonder if their prayers would go unanswered in humanity's darkest hour. The first contact with the enemy revealed the true nature of the threat they faced. These were not mere warriors, but something far more terrifying. The mist figures could not be wounded by conventional weapons, their forms shifting and reforming like smoke in the wind. Each blow passed through them as if striking air, while their touch brought instant death to the living. The warriors realized they were not the first to face this enemy. Ancient battlefields still bore witness to conflicts that had raged for centuries, with armies of the dead locked in combat that would never end. The very ground remembered the blood that had been spilled, and the air itself seemed to hold the echoes of countless battles fought and lost. The enemy's power was such that it could corrupt even the bravest hearts. When warriors looked upon their own reflections, they saw not their faces but the visages of death itself. The shield became a mirror to the soul, revealing the fate that awaited all who opposed the army of shadows. Some warriors fled at the sight, abandoning their weapons and their honor. Even the strongest fortresses could not hold against such an enemy. The castle's walls, which had withstood countless mortal sieges, proved useless against warriors who could pass through solid stone. Arrows fired by spectral archers found their marks regardless of physical barriers, and the very foundations of the stronghold began to crumble under supernatural assault. The battle had been lost, and the warrior knew it. His companions lay scattered across the field, their weapons useless against enemies who could not truly die. His own blade had shattered against armor that was no longer flesh, and his shield had been torn from his grasp by forces beyond mortal strength. Yet still he stood, prepared to sell his life dearly even in the face of certain defeat. In those final moments, the warrior felt his life force being drawn away by powers he could not comprehend. His hand reached toward the sky as if seeking divine intervention, but the light that answered was not from the heavens. It was the cold radiance of death itself, calling him to join the ranks of those he had fought so desperately to destroy. The warrior's death marked his transformation rather than his end. His spirit rose from his broken body, no longer bound by mortal flesh but still wearing the armor of his earthly existence. The other spirits welcomed him to their ranks, for he had proven himself worthy of eternal service. Now he would march with the army he had once opposed, bound to fight battles that would never end. The army that had been assembled was beyond mortal comprehension. Thousands upon thousands of warriors marched in perfect formation, their steps synchronized as if controlled by a single mind. Behind them lay a trail of complete destruction, for they had left nothing living in their wake. The very earth trembled beneath their supernatural march. The berserker's rage proved useless against enemies who had no physical form to strike. His axe swung through empty air while the skeletal warrior reached toward him with hands that could steal the very life from his body. The warrior felt his strength draining away with each passing moment, his legendary fury turning to helpless terror as he realized the futility of his resistance. At the heart of the enemy's hierarchy sat a throne that had been empty for generations. Yet the courtiers who served their unseen master were no less deadly for their lack of mortal presence. The very walls seemed to remember the ancient bargains that had been struck, and the air itself whispered of kingdoms that had fallen to this same supernatural force. Even death could not stop the enemy's growth. In workshops that existed between worlds, the remains of fallen warriors were reforged into new soldiers. Broken bones were welded together with molten metal, and rusted armor was reshaped to fit supernatural forms. The very concept of permanence was violated as the dead were given new purpose in service to darkness. The last defenders of humanity formed their final circle, knowing that retreat was no longer possible. Their weapons flickered with the only light that could harm their enemies, yet they were vastly outnumbered. Each warrior had seen their companions fall, had witnessed the transformation that awaited them. Still they fought, for some things were worth dying for, even when death offered no release. The source of the enemy's power had finally been located. Behind the ancient gate, the army was being summoned from realms beyond mortal comprehension. The protective runes that had held them at bay for centuries were finally failing, their magic draining away as the supernatural tide overwhelmed every defense. Soon there would be no barrier between the living world and the forces of eternal darkness. The priest knew that this was the moment for which he had been preparing his entire life. The holy symbols in his hands blazed with divine light, and his voice rang out with prayers that had been spoken since the beginning of time. Yet even his faith was tested as the supernatural force flowing from the gate threatened to overwhelm his mortal form and drag him into the darkness beyond. The ancient protections that had held the enemy at bay for so long were finally failing. The runes cracked and faded like autumn leaves, their magic draining away as the supernatural force behind them was overwhelmed. Through the widening gaps, the dark mist began to seep into the mortal realm, carrying with it whispers of the damned and promises of eternal service to powers beyond human comprehension. With the barriers failing, the warriors knew they had only one chance to stop the enemy's advance. The Viking charged toward the gate with his sword blazing with supernatural fire, his companions following close behind with shields locked in formation. They would either seal the gate forever or join the ranks of those who had already fallen in this eternal battle. The gate could not hold against the supernatural force that pressed against it. It exploded outward in a burst of stone and magic, sending fragments flying like deadly weapons while the enemy poured through the opening in an endless tide. The warriors' desperate charge had come too late, and now the full force of the army was unleashed upon the mortal realm. The final battle raged across the mountain valley like a storm of death itself. Living warriors fought with weapons that blazed with holy fire against enemies who could not truly die. The ground itself cracked under the impact of blows that carried supernatural force, and the air shimmered with energies that no mortal should have to face. Yet still the defenders fought, knowing that the fate of all humanity hung in the balance. The berserker's roar echoed across the battlefield as he brought his blazing axe down upon his enemy. For once, his weapon found solid contact, and the skeletal warrior's form flickered with supernatural energy as holy fire consumed its bones. His companions closed ranks around him, their own weapons blazing with the same divine light, for they had finally found a way to strike back against the seemingly invincible enemy. The source of the enemy's power had been revealed at last. The shattered crown lay upon the floor, its fragments still pulsing with dark energy as skeletal hands reached toward it from the cracks in reality itself. The throne room had become a nexus where all the supernatural forces converged, and portals to other realms opened in the walls like wounds in the fabric of existence. The priest channeled every ounce of his divine power into the final ritual. Holy symbols blazed with golden light that pushed back the dark mist gathering around his feet, and his voice rang out with prayers that had been spoken since the dawn of creation. The very air seemed to respond to his sacred incantations, as if the heavens themselves were lending their strength to this final confrontation. Under the priest's divine power, the shattered crown began to reassemble itself. The fragments rose into the air, glowing with golden light that pushed back the dark mist and forced the skeletal hands to withdraw into the cracks from whence they came. The portals that had been pouring forth the enemy's army began to close, their supernatural energy disrupted by the holy force that now filled the chamber. The warriors formed a protective circle around their holy ally, knowing that his ritual was their only hope of victory. The skeletal enemies pressed closer, their forms flickering with dark energy as they sensed their power beginning to fade. The warrior's sword blazed with intensified light, and his shield reflected the holy energy that now filled the chamber, creating a barrier that even the undead could not easily breach. As the crown settled into place, ghostly blue flames erupted from within the empty space where a head should have been. The royal symbol now pulsed with energy that combined both divine and supernatural forces, creating a power that was neither wholly good nor entirely evil. The throne room filled with swirling light and shadow as these opposing forces struggled for final dominance, and the fate of both realms hung in the balance. The final effort proved too much for the aging priest. He collapsed to his knees as golden light streamed from his hands toward the crown, his face showing the exhaustion of one who had given everything for this moment. His companions rushed to support him as the ritual reached its climax, and the crown's energy began to stabilize under the combined force of divine power and mortal sacrifice. The crown could not withstand the combined forces that had been unleashed against it. It exploded in a burst of golden and blue light that banished the dark mist and reduced the skeletal warriors to dust. The throne room filled with brilliant radiance as the ancient evil that had threatened the mortal realm was finally broken and banished back to the void from whence it had come. The battle was won, though at a terrible cost. The Viking warrior stood among the scattered remains of his enemies, golden light streaming through the cracks in the stone ceiling as the supernatural threat finally ended. His companions gathered around him, their weapons still glowing with residual holy energy, and peace returned to the mountain pass as the darkness was banished forever. The stone gate began to close with a grinding sound that echoed through the mountain pass, its ancient runes reappearing along the surface as the supernatural energy retreated back through the portal. Behind the gate, the skeletal army dissolved into mist while their weapons clattered to the stone floor, their eternal service finally ended by the power of sacrifice and divine intervention. As dawn touched the mountain peaks, the Viking warrior looked toward the horizon with eyes that had seen too much but still held hope for the future. His companions stood silently behind him, their weapons finally at rest after the long battle against impossible odds. Peace settled over the land like a gentle blanket, and birds began to sing as life returned to the valley after the long night of supernatural terror had finally ended.